The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Raymill House as Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell adjusted her bulletproof vest. Behind her, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles waited silently on the country lane, their occupants checking equipment one final time. This was no ordinary raid. The target was Queen Camilla's private estate in Wiltshire, and the stakes couldn't be higher. 3 months earlier, a routine inventory at Buckingham Palace had revealed something shocking. Several priceless royal artifacts were missing, including a diamond tiara worth £12 million, ancient ceremonial swords, and rare manuscripts dating back centuries. The discovery had sent shockwaves through the palace, but the investigation had been kept strictly confidential to avoid public embarrassment. Detective Inspector Mitchell had been handpicked to lead the investigation due to her discretion and expertise in high-profile cases. What started as a simple theft inquiry had gradually evolved into something much more complex. Anonymous tips had begun arriving at Scotland Yard, all pointing toward the same shocking possibility that Queen Camilla herself might be involved in the disappearance of the royal treasures. The evidence had slowly built up like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Bank records showed mysterious large payments to offshore accounts. Security footage revealed unusual late-night visits to restricted areas of the palace. Most damning of all, a former palace employee had come forward with explosive allegations about secret meetings and hushed conversations about moving valuable items to safer locations. Mitchell remembered the moment she first briefed her superior about the case. Chief Inspector Robert Hayes had gone pale when she presented the evidence. The idea that a member of the royal family could be involved in stealing crown jewels was almost unthinkable. Yet the facts were pointing in an uncomfortable direction, and they couldn't ignore them simply because of who was involved. The decision to raid Camilla's private estate had not been taken lightly. Weeks of surveillance had confirmed suspicious activity around the property. Strange vehicles arrived at odd hours, and thermal imaging had detected movement in areas of the house that should have been empty. The legal team had worked around the clock to secure the necessary warrants, ensuring every step was legally sound. As Mitchell checked her watch, she reflected on how this case had consumed her life for the past 3 months. The pressure from above was immense. The royal family's reputation hung in the balance, and any mistake could have international consequences. The media knew nothing yet, but she knew that wouldn't last long once they moved in. Her radio crackled to life. "All units, this is base. You have green light for operation." "Repeat green light." Mitchell took a deep breath and signaled to her team. 20 officers emerged from their vehicles, moving with practiced precision toward the estate's main entrance. The house itself was impressive but not ostentatious. Built in the 18th century, it had been Camilla's private retreat long before she became queen. The gardens were immaculate, and peacocks wandered freely across the grounds. It seemed almost impossible that such a peaceful place could be hiding stolen royal treasures worth millions of pounds. As they approached the front door, Mitchell noticed curtains twitching in an upstairs window. Someone was home and watching their approach. She pressed the ornate doorbell and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy wooden door opened to reveal Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, Camilla's longtime housekeeper. The elderly woman's face showed no surprise at seeing the police on her doorstep. Instead, there was something that looked almost like relief in her eyes. "We've been expecting you," she said quietly, stepping aside to let them enter. Her words sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. How could they have been expecting a raid that had been planned in absolute secrecy? The interior of the house was elegant but comfortable, filled with antique furniture and family photographs. Mitchell noticed several paintings on the walls that looked suspiciously like they belonged in a royal collection. Her trained eye also spotted display cases that appeared to house valuable artifacts, though she couldn't immediately identify them. Mrs. Hartwell led them into a sitting room where afternoon tea had been prepared for one person. The cup was still warm, suggesting someone had left in a hurry. "Where is Her Majesty?" Mitchell asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The housekeeper's sad smile confirmed her fears. "She left this morning, ma'am. Said she had urgent business in London." As her team began their systematic search of the property, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully orchestrated situation. The housekeeper's calm demeanor, the prepared tea, the timing of Camilla's departure, it all felt too convenient. Either they were dealing with someone who was extremely confident in their innocence, or someone who had been planning for this day for a long time. The first hour of searching revealed nothing obviously incriminating. The house was exactly what one would expect from a member of the royal family, expensive but tasteful, filled with antiques and artwork. But Mitchell's experienced eye noted several empty spaces on walls and shelves where valuable items had clearly been recently removed. Then, as her team moved into the basement, everything changed. Behind a false wall in what appeared to be a wine cellar, they discovered a hidden room. Inside, carefully arranged on custom-built shelves, were dozens of items that clearly didn't belong in a private residence. Ancient crowns, ceremonial weapons, and priceless manuscripts were displayed like trophies in a collector's private museum. Mitchell stood in the doorway of the hidden room, her heart pounding as she realized the magnitude of what they had discovered. This wasn't just about a few missing items from the palace inventory. This was a systematic collection of royal treasures that appeared to have been accumulated over many years. The question that burned in her mind was simple yet terrifying. How deep did this go, and who else was involved in what appeared to be the crime of the century? The hidden room beneath Camilla's estate was like stepping into a secret museum of stolen royal history. Detective Inspector Mitchell moved carefully between the displays, her flashlight revealing treasures that most people would only ever see in official photographs. Each item was meticulously labeled with small handwritten cards, as if someone had been maintaining a careful inventory of their illegal collection. Dr. James Whitmore, the royal historian who had been quietly brought in to assist with the investigation, stood beside Mitchell with his mouth agape. His hands shook as he photographed each item with his phone, occasionally muttering under his breath about the historical significance of what they were seeing. "This crown," he whispered, pointing to a delicate silver piece adorned with emeralds, was thought to be lost in a fire at Windsor Castle in 1894. It's been missing for over a century. The scope of the collection was staggering. Ancient swords that had belonged to medieval kings lay alongside modern ceremonial pieces. Rare books and manuscripts were stored in climate-controlled cases, some dating back to the Norman conquest. Most shocking of all was a section dedicated to items that were still supposed to be on active display in various royal residences. The theft had clearly been happening for years, possibly decades. Mitchell's team worked methodically, photographing and cataloging every item before carefully removing it as evidence. The process was painstaking, as many of the artifacts were extremely fragile and worth millions of pounds. Each piece had to be handled with the utmost care, while preserving any potential forensic evidence that might reveal how it had ended up in this underground lair. As they worked, Mrs. Hartwell remained in the sitting room above, occasionally bringing tea to the officers. Her behavior puzzled Mitchell. The elderly housekeeper showed no signs of distress or surprise at the discovery of the hidden room. Instead, she seemed almost relieved, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. During a brief break from cataloging the artifacts, Mitchell decided to question the housekeeper more thoroughly. She found Mrs. Hartwell sitting quietly in her kitchen, staring out the window at the gardens where peacocks continued their leisurely stroll, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside the house. "How long have you worked for Her Majesty?" Mitchell asked, settling into the chair opposite the elderly woman. Mrs. Hartwell's weathered hands wrapped around her teacup as she considered the question. 43 years, she replied softly. "I started when she was still married to her first husband, long before she became part of the royal family." The conversation that followed revealed a story that Mitchell hadn't expected. Mrs. Hartwell spoke of watching Camilla transform from a country woman with simple tastes into someone obsessed with royal history and prestige. "It started innocently enough," the housekeeper explained. "She would bring home small items from the palaces, claiming they were gifts or personal mementos. I never questioned it at the time. But over the years, the items became more valuable and more obviously inappropriate for a private collection." Mrs. Hartwell described late-night visits from mysterious individuals who would deliver carefully wrapped packages. She spoke of construction work on the basement that Camilla had insisted be kept secret from everyone, including her own security detail. "I knew it was wrong," Mrs. Hartwell admitted, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But I was frightened. She wasn't the same person I had served for all those years. She became secretive, paranoid. She made it clear that my silence was the price of my continued employment, and at my age, I couldn't afford to lose this position. Mitchell felt a mixture of sympathy and frustration as she listened to the housekeeper's story. Here was someone who had witnessed crimes being committed for years but had felt powerless to report them. It was a common pattern in cases involving powerful individuals, loyalty and fear creating a conspiracy of silence that allowed criminal behavior to continue unchecked. Meanwhile, back in London, the investigation was expanding rapidly. Mitchell's colleagues at Scotland Yard were quietly pursuing leads that suggested the stolen royal treasures weren't just being hoarded. Some were being sold on the international black market for ancient artifacts. Financial investigators had traced payments from several wealthy private collectors to accounts linked to Shell, companies that appeared to be controlled by someone with intimate access to the royal family. The revelation that items were being sold as well as collected added a new dimension to the case. This wasn't just about someone with an unhealthy obsession with royal history. This was about someone who had been systematically looting the crown's treasures for personal profit, betraying not just their position but the trust of the entire nation. As news of the raid began to leak to the media, palace officials went into crisis management mode. Emergency meetings were called, and public relations experts worked frantically to prepare statements that would minimize damage to the royal family's reputation. The challenge was enormous. How do you explain that a queen consort has been accused of stealing from her own family's collection? Back at the estate, Mitchell received a call that changed everything. King Charles himself was requesting an immediate briefing on what had been discovered. The conversation was scheduled for that evening at a secure location, and Mitchell knew that her presentation would likely determine how the case proceeded. The pressure was immense. She was essentially about to brief the head of state about evidence suggesting his wife was a criminal. As the day wore on, the hidden room gradually emptied as evidence was carefully transported to secure storage facilities. Each removed artifact revealed more of the room's sophisticated setup. Hidden security cameras had been recording everything, suggesting that Camilla had been documenting her collection, possibly for insurance purposes or to maintain records for potential buyers. The discovery of the cameras raised new questions about who else might have been involved in the operation. The sophisticated nature of the hidden room, the international sales network, the complex financial arrangements, it all suggested that Camilla hadn't been working alone. Someone with expertise in art theft, international finance, and security systems had been helping her. As evening approached and the estate fell quiet, Mitchell stood once more in the now empty hidden room. The sophisticated lighting and climate control systems were still running, creating an eerie atmosphere in the space that had once housed some of Britain's most precious historical artifacts. She couldn't help but wonder how many other such rooms might exist, and whether they were only seeing the tip of what could be the largest theft of royal treasures in British history. The secure briefing room at New Scotland Yard had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. King Charles arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, accompanied only by his private secretary and a single protection officer. Detective Inspector Mitchell had spent hours preparing for this moment, knowing that her presentation would likely determine not just the future of the investigation, but potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. The king's face remained impassive as Mitchell laid out the evidence they had discovered at Raymill House. Photographs of the stolen artifacts filled the large screen at the front of the room, each image more damaging than the last. Ancient crowns, ceremonial weapons, priceless manuscripts, all items that should have been safely housed in official royal collections, now proven to have been secretly stored in his wife's private estate. What struck Mitchell most about the meeting was Charles's lack of surprise. As she presented each piece of evidence, his expression remained controlled, almost resigned. When she finished her presentation, he sat in silence for several long minutes, staring at the final photograph on the screen, a medieval sword that had belonged to one of his ancestors. "How long has this been going on?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell consulted her notes, though she knew the timeline by heart. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, we believe the thefts began at least 15 years ago, possibly longer. The hidden room appears to have been constructed shortly after Her Majesty moved into Raymill House permanently." The king nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had long suspected, but hoped was untrue. His private secretary, Sir William Ashford, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Your Majesty, we need to discuss the constitutional implications of this situation. The media will inevitably learn of the raid, and we must be prepared for the public reaction." Mitchell watched the exchange with fascination and sympathy. Here was a man who had waited his entire life to become king, only to discover that his wife had been systematically stealing from the crown's collection. The personal betrayal must have been devastating, but the constitutional crisis it created was potentially even more damaging. The discussion that followed revealed the complex web of relationships and obligations that surrounded the royal family. Every decision had to be weighed not just for its legal implications, but for its impact on the institution of monarchy itself. The king spoke of his duty to the nation, even when it conflicted with his personal loyalties and emotions. During a brief recess, Mitchell received an urgent call from her team. They had made another discovery at the estate, a sophisticated computer system hidden behind a false wall in Camilla's study. Digital forensics experts were already working to recover deleted files, but preliminary analysis suggested the existence of detailed records of sales to private collectors around the world. The computer files painted a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Detailed photographs of each stolen item were accompanied by historical research, authenticity certificates, and correspondence with potential buyers. Email chains revealed negotiations with collectors in Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, with some items selling for tens of millions of pounds. Most shocking of all were the financial records showing where the money had gone. Rather than being hoarded for personal use, much of the proceeds had been donated to various charities and causes. Camilla had apparently been using the royal collection as her own personal fundraising source, stealing priceless artifacts to support what she considered worthy organizations. When Mitchell returned to the briefing room to present this new evidence, the king's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. The revelation that his wife had been justifying her crimes as charitable acts seemed to cut deeper than any of the previous discoveries. "She actually believed she was doing good," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and anguish. The meeting stretched well past midnight as lawyers, security experts, and constitutional scholars joined the discussion. The legal situation was unprecedented. How do you prosecute a queen consort for stealing from the crown? The political implications were equally complex, with potential impacts on everything from international relations to the future of the Commonwealth. As the various experts debated procedures and precedents, Mitchell found herself thinking about Mrs. Hartwell's words from earlier that day. The elderly housekeeper had described watching Camilla change over the years, becoming secretive and paranoid. It raised uncomfortable questions about the psychological pressures of royal life and whether those pressures had contributed to what appeared to be a gradual descent into criminal behavior. The king's decision, when it finally came, surprised everyone in the room. Rather than seeking to minimize the damage or cover up the scandal, he insisted that the investigation proceed with full transparency. "The monarchy must be above reproach," he stated firmly. "If my wife has committed crimes, she must face the same justice as any other citizen. The institution is more important than any individual, including myself." His words carried the weight of centuries of royal tradition, but also reflected a modern understanding of constitutional monarchy. The king recognized that attempting to protect Camilla would ultimately do more damage to the crown than allowing justice to take its course. It was a decision that would define his reign and potentially reshape the monarchy for future generations. As the meeting concluded and the various officials departed, Mitchell remained behind with the king for a few final minutes. In this private moment, away from the constitutional experts and media advisors, Charles spoke as a husband rather than a monarch. "I keep wondering if there were signs I missed," he said quietly. "She was always passionate about history, about preserving the past. I thought it was admirable. The personal tragedy behind the constitutional crisis was impossible to ignore. Here was a man who had found love late in life, only to discover that his partner had been living a double life that threatened everything he held dear. The weight of that betrayal, combined with his duty as king, created a burden that Mitchell could barely imagine. As she prepared to leave, the king made one final request. Please ensure that Mrs. Hartwell is treated fairly in all of this. She was caught in an impossible situation and I don't want her to suffer for my wife's crimes." It was a gesture of compassion that reminded Mitchell why, despite all the constitutional complications, many people still believed in the institution of monarchy. The drive back to her hotel through the empty streets of London gave Mitchell time to reflect on the day's revelations. What had started as a simple theft investigation had evolved into something that could reshape the British monarchy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the search for Camilla intensified, and the media began to grasp the full scope of the scandal that was about to engulf the royal family. The manhunt for Queen Camilla had been underway for 36 hours when the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A small bed and breakfast owner in the Scottish Highlands called the police tip line, reporting that a woman matching Camilla's description had checked in using a false name. The caller, Mrs. Margaret Douglas, had recognized her guest despite the wig and sunglasses, because of a distinctive ring she couldn't bring herself to remove. Detective Inspector Mitchell was on a helicopter heading north within 2 hours of receiving the call. The remote location made sense from a tactical perspective. The tiny village of Glenfinnan was surrounded by mountains and had limited escape routes. But it also raised questions about whether Camilla had been planning this escape route for some time, or if she was simply hoping to disappear into the Scottish wilderness. As their helicopter approached the village, Mitchell could see the dramatic landscape that had attracted tourists and filmmakers for decades. The famous railway viaduct stretched across the valley like a concrete rainbow, and ancient castles dotted the shores of the loch. It was beautiful but isolated, the perfect place for someone trying to avoid detection. The bed and breakfast sat on the edge of the village, a traditional stone building that had been converted to accommodate tourists visiting the area's historic sites. Mrs. Douglas met them at the door, clearly nervous about her role in what had become an international incident. "She seemed so sad," the elderly woman explained as she led them upstairs. "I almost didn't call, but I knew it was the right thing to do." The room Camilla had been occupying told a story of someone who had fled in haste, but was trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Expensive clothes were neatly hung in the wardrobe, but they were clearly chosen for concealment rather than style. A collection of books about Scottish history lay on the bedside table, suggesting she had been trying to distract herself with reading during her brief exile. Most intriguingly, they found a handwritten letter on the desk, sealed but not addressed to anyone in particular. Mitchell opened it carefully, aware that its contents might provide crucial insight into Camilla's state of mind and motivations. The letter was several pages long, written in Camilla's distinctive handwriting, and addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." The confession, for that's what it clearly was, painted a picture of someone who had started with good intentions but had gradually lost sight of right and wrong. Camilla wrote about her initial fascination with royal history and her desire to ensure that precious artifacts were properly preserved and appreciated. She described her growing frustration with what she saw as the casual attitude of some palace officials toward the historical treasures in their care. "I told myself I was rescuing these pieces," she had written. "I convinced myself that I was a guardian rather than a thief. But I know now that I was simply lying to myself, using noble intentions to justify criminal actions. The worst part is that I continued even when I knew it was wrong, because I couldn't bear to admit what I had become." The letter went on to detail specific thefts, providing information that would help investigators understand the full scope of her crimes. She named accomplices, described the international network of buyers and sellers she had worked with, and provided details about other hidden storage locations that authorities hadn't yet discovered. It was a complete confession that would make prosecution straightforward, assuming they could find her before she disappeared completely. Mrs. Douglas explained that her unusual guest had left early that morning, claiming she needed to catch a train to Inverness. The woman had paid in cash and seemed anxious to avoid any interaction with other guests. Most tellingly, she had asked detailed questions about ferry services to remote Scottish islands, suggesting she might be planning to disappear into the Hebrides. Mitchell immediately coordinated with local police to monitor all transportation hubs in the area. Ferry terminals, train stations, and bus stops were all placed under surveillance, but the Scottish Highlands offered countless hiding places for someone who knew the area well. and Camilla had demonstrated considerable planning and preparation in her criminal activities. As the search expanded, more details about Camilla's international network began to emerge from the computer files recovered at her estate. Her accomplices included art dealers in Geneva, antiquities experts in New York, and even some corrupt auction house employees in London. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over the past 15 years, items worth more than £200 million had been stolen and sold to private collectors around the world. The international implications were becoming clearer as well. Several foreign governments had unknowingly purchased stolen British royal artifacts for their national museums. Diplomatic channels were buzzing with requests for information and offers of cooperation, but also concerns about the potential embarrassment of having to return items that had been acquired in good faith. Meanwhile, back in London, King Charles was dealing with the constitutional crisis that his wife's crimes had created. Parliament was demanding briefings, opposition leaders were calling for investigations into palace security, and the media was having a field day with stories about the criminal queen. Public opinion polls showed a sharp drop in support for the monarchy, with many questioning whether the royal family could be trusted to safeguard the nation's heritage. The king's response to the crisis had been consistently principled, but personally devastating. He had publicly stated that no one was above the law, including members of his own family. He had cooperated fully with the investigation and had even volunteered to testify if needed. But the strain was showing. Palace staff reported that he was working longer hours than ever, as if trying to restore the monarchy's reputation through sheer determination and dedication. As evening fell in the Scottish Highlands, Mitchell received word that a woman matching Camilla's description had been spotted boarding a ferry to the Isle of Skye. The witness was a tourist who had recognized her from news reports. Despite her attempts at disguise, the ferry had already departed by the time authorities received the tip, giving Camilla several hours' head start on an island with countless hiding places. The decision was made to seal off the island and conduct a systematic search. Police officers from across Scotland were being mobilized for what could be the largest manhunt in the country's recent history. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment were being prepared for dawn flights, and marine units were positioning boats to prevent any escape by water, but Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step behind, someone who had been planning this escape for much longer than anyone realized. The sophisticated nature of Camilla's criminal operation suggested someone who thought far ahead and prepared for multiple contingencies. The confession letter, while helpful for the prosecution, might also be a distraction designed to give her more time to disappear completely. As she settled into a hotel room in Portray, the main town on Skye, Mitchell reviewed everything they knew about their quarry. This wasn't just a desperate criminal on the run. This was someone who had successfully operated a complex international crime ring for over a decade without detection. Underestimating Camilla's cunning and preparation could allow her to slip away forever, leaving behind only the devastating damage her crimes had caused to the monarchy and the nation's trust in its institutions. The morning mist hung low over the Isle of Skye, as Detective Inspector Mitchell coordinated the largest search operation in the island's history. From her command post in Portree, she could see helicopters beginning their systematic sweep of the rugged coastline, while police teams prepared to search every building, cave, and potential hiding place on the island. The operation involved over 300 officers, making it impossible for the media to ignore any longer. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth MacLeod, a local historian who ran a small museum in Dunvegan, contacted police after recognizing Camilla from news reports. She explained that a woman matching the description had visited her museum the previous afternoon, asking detailed questions about ancient clan castles and remote archaeological sites on the island. She was particularly interested in ruins that were difficult to reach. Dr. MacLeod explained to Mitchell during their interview. She claimed to be researching a book about forgotten Scottish history, but her questions were very specific about places where someone could stay hidden for extended periods. She seemed to know more about these sites than most tourists would. This information transformed the search strategy. Instead of focusing on populated areas where Camilla might seek shelter, teams were redirected toward remote ruins and archaeological sites scattered across the island's wild landscape. These locations were often accessible only by foot across dangerous terrain, but they offered the isolation that a fugitive would desperately need. The search teams faced challenging conditions as they made their way to these remote locations. Sky's weather could change rapidly from clear skies to driving rain, and the rocky terrain made progress slow and treacherous. Each team was equipped with emergency supplies and communications equipment, as rescue operations in this landscape could be just as dangerous as the original search. Meanwhile, the international investigation was yielding disturbing new revelations about the scope of Camilla's criminal network. Interpol had coordinated raids on galleries and private collections in 6 countries, recovering dozens of additional stolen royal artifacts. The evidence suggested that Camilla had been the central figure in what was essentially an international conspiracy to loot Britain's royal heritage. Swiss bank records revealed accounts containing over £50 million in proceeds from the sales, but investigators were puzzled by the ultimate destination of much of this money. Rather than being used for personal luxury, the funds had been systematically donated to various charities and cultural preservation organizations around the world. It painted a complex picture of someone who saw herself as a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing from the wealthy to fund causes she believed were worthwhile. The psychological profile that emerged from these discoveries was troubling. Experts suggested that Camilla had developed an elaborate system of self-justification that allowed her to view her crimes as noble acts. She had apparently convinced herself that the royal family was failing in their duty to preserve British heritage, and that her actions were necessary to ensure these treasures were properly valued and preserved. Back on Skye, the search teams were making progress despite the challenging conditions. Ancient castle ruins that had stood empty for centuries were systematically searched, along with stone circles, burial cairns, and other archaeological sites scattered across the island. The work was methodical but exhausting, requiring teams to climb steep cliffs and traverse boggy moorland to reach some of the more remote locations. The breakthrough came at sunset on the second day of the island search. A team investigating the ruins of Dunbeag, an ancient broch overlooking the sea, spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be an empty archaeological site. The stone tower had been built over 2,000 years ago and was supposedly uninhabitable, but someone had clearly been using it as shelter. Mitchell arrived at the site within an hour, her helicopter landing on a nearby field as darkness fell over the island. The ancient stone structure stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, and warm light flickered from within its walls. It was an almost surreal scene, a modern fugitive hiding in a fortress that had protected ancient Scots from Roman invaders. The approach had to be handled with extreme care. The broch was surrounded by treacherous rocky ground, and the only entrance was a narrow passage that could easily become a trap for anyone trying to enter. Mitchell decided on a patient approach, establishing a perimeter while attempting to make contact with whoever was inside. "Your Majesty," Mitchell called through a megaphone, her voice echoing off the ancient stones. "This is Detective Inspector Mitchell. We know you're inside and we have the area surrounded. Please come out so we can resolve this situation peacefully." The response came after several long minutes. Not words, but the sound of someone weeping inside the stone walls. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything in Mitchell's extensive experience. Here was a queen consort, hiding in a prehistoric fortress, finally confronted with the full consequences of her actions. Through the narrow entrance, Camilla's voice was barely audible as she spoke about her shame, her fear, and her desperate hope that somehow the situation could be resolved without destroying the monarchy entirely. "I never meant for it to go this far," Camilla called out, her voice broken by emotion. "It started with just one piece, a small manuscript that was being stored improperly. I told myself I was saving it, preserving it for future generations. But then there was another piece and another, and before I knew it, I couldn't stop." The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Mitchell gradually building trust and understanding, while a team of negotiation experts provided guidance through her earpiece. The complexity of the situation was unprecedented. They were dealing with someone who was simultaneously a criminal, a member of the royal family, and a deeply troubled individual who seemed genuinely horrified by what she had become. As the night wore on, Camilla began to provide more details about her crimes and her motivations. She spoke of feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of royal life of struggling to find a meaningful role within the institution of monarchy. She described how stealing and selling the artifacts had initially made her feel powerful and important, as if she was finally doing something significant with her position. "I convinced myself that I was a guardian of history," she said, her voice echoing from within the ancient stones. "I told myself that these pieces were being wasted, stored in vaults where no one could appreciate their beauty or importance. I thought I was giving them new life by finding collectors who would truly value them." The psychological complexity of her justifications was fascinating and disturbing. She had created an elaborate mental framework that transformed theft into preservation, crime into charity, betrayal into service. It was a testament to the human capacity for self-deception, but also to the dangerous pressures that could build within someone struggling to find their place in an institution as complex and demanding as the modern monarchy. As dawn approached, Mitchell knew that the standoff couldn't continue much longer. Media helicopters were already circling the area, and the international press was beginning to focus on the dramatic scene of a queen hiding in an ancient fortress. The longer the situation continued, the more damaging it would become for everyone involved, including the institution of monarchy itself. The first rays of dawn broke over the Isle of Skye as Queen Camilla finally emerged from the ancient broch. Detective Inspector Mitchell watched as the figure appeared in the narrow entrance, no longer trying to disguise her identity. Gone were the wig and sunglasses that had briefly helped her evade detection. Instead, there was a woman who looked exhausted, defeated, but somehow relieved that her double life had finally come to an end. The arrest was conducted with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. Mitchell had specifically requested that no handcuffs be used unless absolutely necessary, recognizing the constitutional sensitivity of arresting a member of the royal family. Camilla offered no resistance as she was formally cautioned and informed of her rights, accepting the situation with a composure that seemed to surprise even the experienced officers present. As they walked away from the ancient fortress, Camilla paused to look back at the stone structure that had provided her final refuge. 2,000 years of history, she said quietly to Mitchell. All those generations of people seeking shelter in the same place. I suppose there's something fitting about ending my story here, surrounded by the past I thought I was protecting. The helicopter journey back to the mainland was conducted in relative silence. Camilla sat quietly, staring out at the dramatic Scottish landscape passing below. Occasionally she would make quiet comments about the historical significance of landmarks they passed, as if her passion for history remained undiminished despite the destruction it had caused in her life. Mitchell found herself oddly moved by these moments, seeing glimpses of the woman Camilla might have been if she had found healthier ways to channel her interests. The media frenzy that greeted their arrival in Edinburgh was unlike anything Scotland had seen in decades. International news crews had descended on the city, and crowds of curious onlookers lined the streets despite the early hour. The constitutional crisis that had been brewing since the raid on Raymill House was now fully realized. Britain was witnessing the arrest and prosecution of a queen consort for crimes against the crown itself. King Charles had traveled to Edinburgh to meet with his wife before her formal arraignment. The private meeting at the secure facility where Camilla was being held lasted over 3 hours, and those present reported that it was one of the most emotionally charged encounters they had ever witnessed. The king emerged looking aged and devastated, but also somehow resolved about the path forward. The legal proceedings that followed would set precedents that would be studied by constitutional scholars for generations. Never before had a modern British monarch's spouse been prosecuted for such serious crimes. The complexity of charging someone who was technically part of the institution she had robbed created legal challenges that required input from experts across multiple fields of law. Camilla's decision to plead guilty to all charges surprised many legal observers who had expected a lengthy trial. Her confession letter and the evidence recovered from her estate made the case against her overwhelming. But royal defendants traditionally fought charges to minimize damage to the monarchy. Instead, Camilla seemed determined to accept full responsibility for her actions, perhaps hoping that complete honesty might somehow begin to repair the damage she had caused. The sentencing hearing revealed the full scope of the crimes for the first time. Over 200 individual artifacts had been stolen over a 15-year period, with a total value exceeding £300 million. The international network of buyers and sellers that Camilla had established had corrupted galleries and auction houses across 3 continents. The damage to Britain's cultural heritage was incalculable, as many items had been sold to private collectors who might never allow them to be seen by the public again. Yet the hearing also revealed the complex motivations behind the crimes. Character witnesses described Camilla's genuine passion for history and her frustration with what she saw as inadequate preservation efforts by official institutions. Mental health experts testified about the psychological pressures of royal life and how they might have contributed to her criminal behavior. It painted a picture of someone who had started with noble intentions, but had lost her way in a maze of self-justification and criminal activity. The judge's final sentence reflected the unprecedented nature of the case. Camilla was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 8 years if she continued to cooperate with efforts to recover stolen items. More significantly, she was stripped of all royal titles and privileges, effectively erasing her from the institution she had betrayed. It was a punishment that addressed both the legal and constitutional aspects of her crimes. The aftermath of the case continued to reverberate for months. King Charles underwent what palace officials described as a period of deep reflection about the future of the monarchy. Public opinion polls showed that while trust in the royal family had been damaged, many people respected the king's handling of the crisis and his commitment to ensuring that justice was served regardless of personal cost. Detective Inspector Mitchell found herself reflecting on the case long after it was officially closed. The investigation had revealed not just individual crimes, but broader questions about the pressures of public life, the challenges of preserving cultural heritage, and the human capacity for both great good and terrible betrayal. She had started the investigation expecting to solve a simple theft case, but had instead uncovered one of the most complex criminal conspiracies in British history. The recovery of the stolen artifacts became a massive international effort involving law enforcement agencies, museums, and cultural institutions around the world. Many items were successfully returned to their rightful places in royal collections, but some remained missing, presumably hidden in private collections whose owners were unwilling to admit they had purchased stolen goods. The full scope of Camilla's crimes might never be completely understood. In the end, the case of the stolen royal treasures became more than just a criminal investigation. It became a defining moment for the modern British monarchy, testing its ability to maintain public trust even when faced with betrayal from within its own ranks. The institution survived, perhaps even strengthened by its commitment to justice over protection of its own members. But the scars left by Camilla's crimes would take much longer to heal, serving as a permanent reminder of the responsibilities that come with privilege and the devastating consequences when those responsibilities are betrayed.